Big news just dropped in the fight over suppressors and short-barreled rifles. Despite the NFA tax being slashed to $0, the Trump administration's Department of Justice is now defending the very regulations gun rights advocates hoped would disappear. This unexpected move has sent shockwaves through the Second Amendment community. Let me break down exactly what's happening and why this matters to every gun owner in America. A major legal battle is unfolding right now that could reshape firearms regulations across the entire country. Multiple gun rights organizations have launched lawsuits challenging the National Firearms Act restrictions, but the current administration's response has surprised many supporters. Here's the background you need to understand. Last year, through appropriations legislation, Congress reduced the NFA transfer tax from $200 down to absolutely nothing for certain items. This includes suppressors, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and other regulated devices. The tax literally went to zero. Gun rights organizations saw this as a massive opportunity. Groups including Gun Owners of America, the Firearms Regulatory Accountability Coalition, Silencer Shop, Palmetto State Armory, and Silencer Central joined forces. 15 states also joined this legal coalition. Their argument is straightforward. If there's no tax anymore, then the constitutional justification for federal control over these items has evaporated. The lawsuit targets the ATF and Department of Justice directly. The plaintiffs argue that registration requirements, transfer restrictions, and other regulatory burdens can no longer be justified. They're asking federal courts to declare that Congress exceeded its constitutional authority by continuing these regulations without any actual tax being collected. Both sides have filed motions requesting summary judgment, which means they want the court to decide the case based on legal arguments alone, without going to a full trial. This could speed up the timeline significantly. However, the Department of Justice, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, has filed extensive legal briefs defending the existing regulatory framework. Their arguments rest on several constitutional foundations. First, the government claims that taxing power still applies. Even though the transfer tax is now zero, they point to occupational taxes that manufacturers, dealers, and importers still pay. According to their legal theory, the registration and approval system helps enforce collection of those industry taxes. They describe this as an interconnected regulatory web that remains necessary for tax enforcement purposes. Second, the Justice Department invokes the Commerce Clause. They argue that these items are manufactured and sold across state lines, making them part of interstate commerce. The regulations attach at every stage: manufacturing, distribution, dealer sales, and individual purchases. The brief even claims authority over purely in-state activity, arguing that unregulated submarkets would create gaps in the federal regulatory scheme. The government goes further, stating that even activity occurring entirely within one state can be regulated. Their reasoning is that allowing unregistered items would undermine the entire federal framework they've constructed. Interestingly, the Justice Department also addresses what should happen if they lose. They argue that even if courts find constitutional problems, any remedy should apply only to the specific plaintiffs who filed the lawsuit, not nationwide. They're trying to prevent a broad ruling that would eliminate restrictions for everyone across the country.
In their latest filing supporting summary judgment, the government frames this as a facial challenge to the statute. They claim the plaintiffs aren't just complaining about how the law affects them personally. Instead, according to the DOJ, the lawsuit attempts to eliminate an entire category of federal regulation, affecting multiple types of items nationwide. This framing is strategic. Facial challenges to laws carry the highest burden of proof. The plaintiffs would need to demonstrate that there's absolutely no constitutional scenario under which any aspect of these regulations could ever be valid. The government argues this standard hasn't been met. The Justice Department insists the regulatory framework rests on multiple independent constitutional powers. They argue that even if one justification fails, others remain solid. This redundancy in their legal theory is designed to ensure the regulations survive judicial scrutiny. The brief also tackles Second Amendment arguments head-on. The government relies heavily on Supreme Court precedents and Fifth Circuit rulings. They cite cases holding that items like short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and suppressors fall outside Second Amendment protection. According to their interpretation, these aren't the type of arms the Constitution protects, so restrictions remain permissible, regardless of the tax situation. The DOJ challenges the plaintiffs to prove these items qualify as protected arms under current Supreme Court doctrine. They're confident existing case law supports continued regulation. This creates a complex legal landscape, with multiple proceedings happening simultaneously. Several different lawsuits challenge the remaining restrictions from different angles. All build on the foundation that the $0 tax eliminated the original justification for federal control. Gun rights advocates are pushing back hard against the government's position. They maintain that without an actual tax being collected, the entire house of cards should collapse. The registration requirements, transfer restrictions, waiting periods, and other burdens no longer serve any legitimate governmental purpose tied to taxation. The plaintiffs argue that if Congress wanted to regulate these items, they should do so through different constitutional powers and different statutes. The current framework was built explicitly on taxing authority. Remove the tax, and the structure should fall. However, as we can see from these latest filings, the administration isn't conceding anything. They're defending every aspect of the existing regulatory regime, using every constitutional argument available to them. This puts Second Amendment advocates in an interesting position. Many supporters of the current administration expected different priorities on gun rights issues. The decision to vigorously defend these restrictions has created tension within the coalition. The courts will ultimately decide these questions. Judges will need to interpret complex constitutional doctrines around taxation, commerce, and the Second Amendment. Their rulings could have enormous implications, extending far beyond just these specific items. If the plaintiffs prevail, it could mean the end of registration requirements and transfer restrictions for suppressors and short-barreled firearms nationwide. Millions of gun owners would gain access to these items without federal paperwork and waiting periods. If the government wins, the regulatory framework remains intact despite the zero tax. This would establish precedent that federal firearms regulations can persist even when their original constitutional justification has been removed.
The timeline for decisions remains uncertain. Summary judgment motions can be decided relatively quickly, or courts might want additional briefing and arguments. Appeals are virtually guaranteed regardless of who wins at the trial court level. Multiple federal circuits could eventually weigh in if different cases in different jurisdictions reach conflicting conclusions. That would set up potential Supreme Court review to resolve splits between circuits. For now, the existing rules remain in effect. Anyone wanting to acquire suppressors or short-barreled firearms still must go through the registration process, even though they no longer pay the transfer tax. The $0 tax eliminated the fee, but didn't automatically eliminate the regulatory requirements. This situation highlights the complex relationship between taxation and regulation in constitutional law. Courts have historically given Congress broad latitude to regulate under the guise of taxing authority. But what happens when the tax disappears while the regulations remain? These are the fundamental questions that judges will need to answer. The outcomes will shape firearms policy and constitutional interpretation for years to come. Every gun owner should pay attention to how these cases develop because the implications extend well beyond just the specific items being discussed. The legal battle over NFA restrictions continues to evolve with high stakes for gun rights across America. Despite the tax being eliminated, the current administration is mounting a full defense of existing regulations using multiple constitutional theories. The coming months will reveal whether courts accept those arguments or side with gun rights organizations seeking to dismantle the regulatory framework. This is a fight worth watching closely because the results will affect millions of Americans and could reshape the boundaries of federal firearms authority.